Today we're going to go through the first exercise in the Zero Bullshit Haskell series. We're going to be doing a couple of things. We're going to set up a new stock project and we're going to learn about the Zero Bullshit package, which is basically a very simple web server library similar to Express.js or Sinatra in the Ruby world. And all the exercises in this series are about creating some sort of web server. In this case, we just want to have a server that exposes a hello root and it just returns hello. To make things clearer, and if you're familiar with Node.js, there's a reference implementation here with Express. So this is basically what we're going to do today, but in Haskell. You can see here there are integration tests that you can run straight from your browser, and we're going to do that as soon as we have a server running locally. So the first thing we want to do is create a new stock project, and you can name it however you want. With this new project, we just want to make sure that it builds and runs. So let's do that real quick. Cool, and you can see that when we run our project, it just outputs some func, which is a weird way of saying hello world. I'm gonna be using Visual Studio Code for the time being. I really want you to understand that the editor you use doesn't really matter in the Haskell world because the compiler is so good and you don't really need any extensions or any IDE or anything like that. When you create a stock project, you're going to see two folders, app and source. The app folder you want to leave alone, and you want to write all of your code in the source folder. So whenever you find yourself in need of creating new files, always do that in the source folder. The main module is basically the entry point to your program, and it just needs to have a main function, which is what gets called when your program starts up. You can see here that the main function is just calling some func, which is a function defined in the lib module. Now, I don't think this is particularly pretty, so a couple of things we can do right off the bat is removing the explicit exports, because that just gets in the way when you're just starting out with Haskell. It's, I think, easier to just export everything, as no one else is going to be using your code but you. We can also rename this function to something more appropriate, like run. This is the function that gets called when our program runs, and so we can rename it here as well. And lastly, we can qualify the import of the lib module so that it's easier to understand where the run function is coming from. To check that our program is actually compiling, I'm going to change the message we're printing to the console to what it should have been in the first place. And hopefully all of that compiles and we get hello world. Nice. In order to install the Zero Bullshit package, there are a couple of things you have to do. You first need to add the Zero Bullshit package as a dependency in package YAML, and package YAML is basically package JSON of the Haskell world, so we can just add it here. The problem with this package is that it's not on Hackage, and Hackage is the equivalent of npmjs.org, so it's the package repository for Haskell. And so you have to tell Stack where to fetch the Zero Bullshit package. In this case, it's going to be fetched directly from the Zero Bullshit Haskell repository. So if you open Stack YAML now, you can just copy paste the extra dependencies field. And if we do all of that and we import the Zero server module, and we import it as server just to make it easier, we should still see our program compile. Now you might be wondering, how did I know that Zero server was the module name? You can see here that all the available modules are listed here. In this case, there's only a single module, and it's a very, very simple package. And it's just a few functions and a few types. On a Hackage, you're gonna find that packages might export more than one module. That's often the case. So for example, if I look for the isn package, which is the de facto package to deal with JSON, you can see that it exports a multitude of modules, and you might be wondering which is the one you want to import when you want to do JSON stuff. In this case, a good rule of thumb is that the top level module is usually the one you want to import, as it's the one that provides most of the common functionality that you will end up needing. So in this case, you would just, import qualified data isn as isn, and you'd be good to go. So obviously Haskell is a compiled language, so whenever you install a new dependency, you have to actually compile a bunch of stuff. This is very different from an interpreted language like JavaScript. And of course, I have a typo. It's not sever, it's server. Nice. You can see here I keep running stack run. This is not necessarily the best thing you can do when you're working on a Haskell project. A better option is to use stack build with the file watch flag, so that Stack automatically rebuilds your project whenever there's a change in the source code. So we now have our server library imported. How do we create a server? Well, if we look at the documentation, you can see the very first function is this start server function, and it looks like it's the function we're looking for. So if you want to be proficient with Haskell, you have to learn how to read type signatures. And reading type signatures is really not that hard. You can see here that this function takes a list of handlers and returns an IO of unit, which is exactly what we need here. We're saying that run is of type IO unit. So if we're able to provide a list of handlers, then our program should compile. Now we don't know yet what a handler is, but we can still work around it and provide an empty list. So if we do server start server empty list, this should compile, and if we run it, it should start a server with no handlers, a server that is basically useless. So if I stack run the project in another tab, you can see that the server is in fact running on port 7879, which is the one that the exercises are expecting. And I don't know if you noticed, but the warning message about our server not being up has disappeared. So if I stop this, you can see the message has come back. If I run it again, it disappears. So if I run the tests now, they're going to be failing miserably because we're not handling the hello route, and it's in fact returning 404. So let's go back to the documentation. What is a handler? Now you might have guessed it, a handler is just something that can handle a request. So in this case, we want to write a handler that can handle a get hello request and return hello. So how do we create a handler value? We can use one of these three functions. And as you might guess, this is the first exercise, though it's very likely that the function we need is a simple handler. So how do we get a simple handler? We just have to provide a method. That's, your HTTP method, get, post, or whatever. We have to provide a path. That's going to be /hello. And then we have to provide a callback. And this is very similar to what you do in Express. So you have this callback with a request and response object, and you do your thing inside the callback body. In the Zero Bullshit package, you have to provide a function that takes a request as an argument and returns a response. And if you can provide all of these things, then you'll get a handler back. And once we have a handler, we can supply it to the start server function. So let's create our simple handler. We're going to call it hello handler, and it's going to be of type server handler. And it's gonna be a simple handler. So the first thing we want is a method. In this case, we want one of these two, so it's gonna be get. Then we want to provide a string, which is the path, and it's gonna be hello. And then we need a callback. We can call this, I don't know, hello callback, and we can be very, very verbose and write it as a separate function. So this is a function that goes from request to response. And again, how do I know that this is the type signature of hello callback? Well, I know because the type signature is telling me. And this is not just a question of documentation. If I make an error in my type signature, JC will refuse to compile my program. So this is not just for documentation, and it doesn't go out of date. This is the precise type of the thing you have to provide. So hello callback will take a request and we'll have to return a response. Now, what is a response? We can have a look at it. Just in the same way there are helper functions to create values of type handler, as we've seen here. So to create a handler, you have to use one of these functions. To create a response, you have to use one of these functions. And we want to return a simple string. Recall that we just want to return hello. So string response looks like it's going to do the job. And what's string response? It's just a function that takes a string and returns a response. And obviously what we need is a response, and we have a request. Now we don't want to inspect the request in any way. We don't actually care what the request is. We just want to do several string response and then provide a string. String is going to be hello, and that should be it. Let's see if it compiles. It does. So we can run our project again. Oh, this is interesting. So we have written our handler, but we haven't registered it. So you can see here that our server is still not exposing any routes. In order to use hello handler, we have to provide, it has to be part of the list of handlers that we provide to start server. So recall that start servers takes a list of handlers, and we have a handler here because simple handler returned a handler provided that we feed it with the right with values of the right type. And so we now have a handler in our hands, and we can just give it to start server and see if it compiles. And it does. So if we run it again, nice. Now you can see that our server finally has a root. If we go back to the exercises, refresh the page, and run the tests, they are successful. Our solution was correct. Now, if you got stuck or you have any questions about this exercise or about setting up the stack project or anything else related to Haskell, I created a bunch of issues in the Zero Bullshit Haskell repository specifically for beginners and non-beginners to have a chat and have their questions answered. There are no stupid questions. Do provide feedback on the exercises. I would really love to read your feedback, and anything else you can do to show me that you like the project, it's very welcome. Leave a star or share it on Twitter. All of this stuff helps. So this was the first exercise. Again, if you had problems, drop a message in this issue, and I'll see you next time.